10 million. I mean, just try to wrap your head around that number. It's almost impossible. But that was the human cost of the First World War. Nearly 10 million lives wiped out in just 4 years of unbelievable slaughter. And if the human toll was staggering, the material devastation was just as mind-boggling. We're talking about a direct cost of over $180 billion, and that's in 1918 money. A number that doesn't even begin to capture the sheer scale of the ruined farms, the towns literally wiped off the map, and the economies left in absolute tatters.
So, with the world in ruins, in January 1919, the leaders of the victorious Allied nations all gathered in Paris. And what was their job? Oh, nothing much, just to rebuild half the world and figure out how to make sure this kind of catastrophe could never, ever happen again. Okay, let's dive in and see how they tried to forge what they hoped would be the peace to end all peace.
Because that was the dream, right? Amidst all that wreckage, there was this profound hope. A belief that all that sacrifice had to mean something, that this could finally be the war to end all wars. And for a lot of people, that hope was personified by the arrival of one man who looked like a savior coming from across the ocean.
And that man was the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. You have to understand, when he arrived in Europe, he had this incredible moral authority. Crowds treated him like a messiah, cheering for this figure from the New World who was here to sweep away the old, cynical way of doing things that had led to disaster.
Wilson didn't just show up with good intentions. He came with a radical new plan. His blueprint was incredibly idealistic, but it was also revolutionary. He wanted to redraw the map of Europe based on this idea of national self-determination, letting people govern themselves. He wanted to replace the old autocratic empires with democracies, and, crucially, he wanted to create a League of Nations, a world organization where countries could talk out their problems instead of going to war. It was nothing short of a promise for a whole new world.
But you know how it goes. Those limitless hopes very quickly ran into the brick wall of political reality there in Paris. Wilson's grand vision was about to collide with the tough, self-interested goals of the other victors. The power to remake the world, it turned out, was not going to be shared equally.
Instead of some grand, open conference, power became concentrated in the hands of these 4 men right here. You're looking at, from left to right, Britain's David Lloyd George, Italy's Vittorio Orlando, Francis Georges Clemenceau, and of course Wilson. It started as a bigger group, but soon it was just these 4, meeting in secret, deciding the fate of millions of people.
And this slide just lays it out so perfectly, the massive gap between the idea and the reality. Wilson had called for open covenants openly arrived at. What he got was secret backroom meetings. He talked about the equality of nations. What happened was the great powers dominated everything. The dream of a new world order pretty quickly gave way to the same old game. Every country for itself.
And those national interests were all over the place. That unity the Allies had during the war, yeah, that fell apart almost immediately. Each of the Big Four was pushing for their own goals that were often the complete opposite of what their allies wanted. Any idea of a simple, harmonious peace process was just shattered.
So let's take a look at France. For their prime minister, Georges Clemenceau, it was really simple. 2 things were absolutely non-negotiable. First, security from Germany. You have to remember, they share a long, exposed border. And second, money. Reparations to rebuild the 10 northeastern regions of his country that had been completely and utterly destroyed by the war.
And this table perfectly illustrates the central conflict of the whole conference. France, having suffered the most direct damage, wanted to weaken Germany for good. But Britain had a totally different perspective. For them, Germany's navy was gone, their colonies were gone, so Britain's main goal was to restore the old balance of power in Europe. They actually wanted to keep Germany stable enough to act as a check on France, to make sure France didn't get too powerful on the continent.
This fight came to a boiling point over the Rhineland, that super-strategic buffer zone between France and Germany. France's initial demand was to just lop it off from Germany entirely. Britain and the US said absolutely not, so they hammered out this compromise. Germany would get to keep the Rhineland, but it had to be permanently demilitarized. No German troops, no forts, nothing. And in return, the US and Britain promised to come to France's defense if Germany ever attacked again.
The other massive sticking point was reparations. This is the financial compensation, the bill, demanded from Germany to pay for all the damage of the war, especially the rebuilding of France and Belgium. It was a hugely important and incredibly controversial part of the final treaty.
And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood and most potent parts of the whole treaty, the infamous War Guilt Clause. This became a symbol of national humiliation for Germany, and its legacy of resentment would last for decades. Okay, so this is really crucial to understand. The infamous Article 231, it was actually a legal tool. Its real purpose was to establish Germany's legal liability to pay for damages, something, by the way, they had already agreed to. In fact, the word guilt isn't even in the article, but it was spun politically, both in Germany and outside of it, as a moral judgment, as if the treaty was saying Germany and only Germany was to blame for the entire war.
Now, beyond just dealing with Germany, the peacemakers were redrawing the maps of Central Europe and the Middle East, breaking up the old empires. The problem was, in creating new countries, they often sowed the seeds for entirely new conflicts. Let's take a look at how these new borders ended up creating a whole new set of problems.
So much for Wilson's principle of national self-determination. It got tossed aside all the time when strategic or economic needs were seen as more important. For example, the new nation of Poland was given a path to the sea, but that meant it absorbed about 1 million people who spoke German. Czechoslovakia was created with 3.25 million Germans living inside its new borders, mainly to give the country defensible mountain frontiers. And German-speaking Austria was flat out forbidden from uniting with Germany. All these decisions created huge, angry German minorities inside these brand new countries.
A very similar thing happened in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, so the victors needed a way to divvy up the territory. What they came up with was the mandate system. Now, on paper, it sounded pretty noble. The advanced nations would step in and guide these new territories toward independence. In practice, well, it looked an awful lot like old-school colonialism in a shiny new package.
And this map just shows you the result. Britain and France essentially took a ruler to the map and carved up the region to fit their own interests. They created new places called Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, drawing lines that paid almost no attention to the ethnic and religious groups who actually lived there.
And what made the whole situation a ticking time bomb was the pile of contradictory promises the British had made during the war. They had promised Arab leaders an independent state. At the exact same time, they were secretly signing an agreement with France to slice up that very same territory. And then, on top of all that, they also promised the Zionist movement a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. You just can't make all those promises at once. It created a legacy of conflict that we are still dealing with today.
So, what was the immediate result of this messy, flawed, and deeply controversial peace treaty? Well, the long-term consequences would end up reshaping the entire 20th century in ways nobody in that room in Paris could have possibly foreseen.
The first, and maybe the biggest shock, came from Wilson's own country. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Just like that, America, the country whose president had been the chief architect of this new world, walked away, retreating into isolation and refusing to join the League of Nations or the Security Pact with France.
With America gone, the huge job of enforcing the peace fell entirely on Britain and France, who were now pretty divided themselves. Their alliance from the war just crumbled. They started disagreeing about everything, about reparations, about how to handle Germany, about the Middle East. That spirit of cooperation was gone, replaced by bickering and suspicion.
Which leaves us with the fundamental question, one that people still argue about today. Did the peacemakers of 1919 fail? Was the Treaty of Versailles just a catastrophic mistake that led directly to another world war? Or, and this is the tough part, given the sheer scale of the devastation, all those conflicting interests, and the incredible complexity of the problems they faced, was a truly fair and lasting peace simply impossible to achieve in the first place?